Hello, everyone. My name is Jose Ocano. I work here at Best Friends as the Senior Director of Culture and Talent. And a huge part of what culture and talent means to Best Friends has always involved diversity, equity, and inclusion. And based off of what's happening in the world and in the United States right now, it's an important time for us to really lean into that part of what culture means to us here at Best Friends and in the movement. So I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation and to introduce two amazing human beings who are going to have a conversation with everybody. But before we get started, I do want to go over some housekeeping for everybody. So everyone is automatically muted for the presentation portion of this webinar so that you don't have to worry about accidentally unmuting yourself, something that I am definitely guilty of. And if you have any questions at any point, please type it in the chat box. Questions submitted through the Q&A box are only visible on our end. And we may pause a few times throughout the presentation to answer questions from the Q&A if they're relevant to the topic at hand. But in general, I think what we're going to do is have Julie and James have this conversation and leave the last, 15 minutes to 25 minutes for Q&A. We've also scheduled time for any additional questions. Oh, look, there's my bullet point. I just read that. Keep an eye on the chat box for links to resources. These plus more will also be posted on the resource section of the Town Hall webpage sometime tomorrow. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available after the session via our website. One of the things that I really want to convey to everybody is conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially as it pertains to race and ethnicity, can be incredibly charged. And it's really important that as we're here learning and listening, that we understand that we are all at very different places of knowledge. We come from different viewpoints because of our life experiences. And so it's so important that we actually are here to meet each other where we are and, really lean into curiosity and really being open to learning and something that is different than what we used to be, than what we're used to. And so I just wanted to convey that it's something that as we've had these conversations within Best Friends, have been a really integral part of making these conversations productive and constructive. So with that, I want to introduce our fearless CEO and a friend, Julie Castle, CEO of Best Friends Animal Society, and a new friend who I have so much respect for, James Evans, President of Companions and Animals for Reform and Equity, also known as CARE. So with that, hello, James and Julie. Such a pleasure to be with you again. And Julie, take it away.
All right.
Yeah,
Thank you, Jose. It is so great to be with everybody here today. Thank you for joining. I think we have a really well-attended webinar. We've got some really cool stuff that we're going to talk about today. And the feature of that is James and his perspective. And James, welcome. It's so good to see you again. It's an honor to be with you today. And I want to start by saying, I really appreciate the time that you're taking to really be with all of us here to discuss this really important topic. And I want to give you the opportunity to tell us a little bit about who you are and tell us a little bit about what CARE is.
Well, thank you. We've been exchanging email thank yous, and it's really genuine. I cannot tell you how much respect I have for you for having me on, for listening, and more importantly for leading. Like this is real leadership. These conversations are so rare, and they need to happen more often. And hopefully in the future they won't happen in the shadow of tragedy, and that we'll just start to learn to listen to each other's pain and understand how to move forward from there. I should also say thank you to Spring Point, Life O'Reilly. CARE would not exist if it were not for Spring Point. You talk about leadership. The Spring Point leadership actually came to me after looking at the work I've done in the field and said, what would you do if we granted you money to create some diversity and inclusion in the field? So that's real leadership. That was before George Floyd. That was before some of the recent deaths we've seen. So that's real leadership. So I have been in the mass comms arena for, I'm getting old, for almost 30 years. I started my firm in 1999. We did a lot of social justice work. We've done a lot of public health work, anti-smoking cessation, anti-gun violence. I love the work. I love people. Sort of out of the blue in 2008, HSUS asked us to work on the Gulf Spaniarder campaign. And this is the Gulf of Mexico. So this is Louisiana and Mississippi, some of the hardest hit cities, states in the country, both by Katrina, but also by poverty. And so coming out of that campaign where we were encouraging folks to do free spay neuter, I realized and passed that on to Heather Camisa, who was in charge of spay neuter at HSUS at the time, that something really needed to be done. If we were going to get more spay neuters happening, and they really needed to be free. So that birthed Pets for Life, which is a national program now in, I think, 50 different cities. And so myself and Kenny Lamberti and others were chief architects of that program. And you're lucky you have Kitty there with you. So we've done a lot of other work in animal welfare, including puppy mills, free roaming cat, national research. But in every aspect of what we've been doing in the field, we've constantly noticed that something was missing, and it's always that sort of lack of inclusion. You know, so many problems that we have in the field and in our greater society are a reflection of folks being left out. So one of the last documents we worked on was A Doctor's Welcome, which is really a focus, a document, a toolkit, which focuses on not just encouraging open adoption, but sort of walking shelters and rescues through what that looks like, how to become a place that is open enough intellectually and emotionally, where open adoption becomes the next natural process. So out of all of that work, when Spring Point Life O'Reilly approached us, we knew immediately what CARE needed to do, which was to focus on bringing more inclusion and diversity to the animal welfare world, but both inside of shelters and rescues, but also sort of opening up and having conversations with communities of color that are very often neglected in the animal welfare world. And so in that space, in that realm of people of color, there are adopters, there are people that love their pets, there are zealot pet lovers that we're just not reaching out to. And in my mind and in the mind of my team, if we can build a movement that encourages those folks to join a movement that already exists, we will simply save millions of animals. Because if you think about it in a sales way, if this was a retail environment, people of color are our new lead. These are people that if we were to engage them in a massive way, we would see massive changes in lives being saved. So we're saying over and over again, inclusion equals life saving. And I cannot thank you enough for having us on.
Well, and if you're so inclined to donate, and now is an incredible time to care, it's so needed. We'll post the link to your organization, and you know, I just think it's such an important thing to support. So, you know, we've talked before, and we both share a love of history. And you know, I studied it in college. I was a political science major as well. And I really truly believe that in order to figure out, you know, that saying, start with the end in mind, you really need to understand both ends. You need to understand where you've come from. And so I want you to just give our viewers just a brief history, because I think a lot of people see all this turmoil happening. It's history repeating itself. And so, James, tell us about that. And then I want to tackle some of these tough conversations. I want to talk about animal welfare, but I want to talk about what we're experiencing right now in our world, because it's terrifying, it's very scary, but I think it's also a necessary moment for us to go through. And so tell us a little bit about the history of this from your perspective.
Thank you. I'll do the brief. And by the way, I was a visual arts major, so my love of history first started in the visual arts, sort of seeing history played out through painting. So we have this clash of perspectives, but if you don't understand the country's start, it's imperative to look at some of those resources that we put up to really understand how the country started. We are an incredibly hypocritical beginning. So we are both at one end chasing our own freedom, and on the other end, perfectly willing to subjugate other people and in that process. So we are also a very, a religious country. So, Harvard, for instance, was one of the first institutions created in the country as a divinity school, a church, a school for teaching people how to love and connect with God. But at the same time, the staff is chasing down Native Americans, and if they don't, become Christian, they're killed and brutalized. And so those are our beginnings. And I think, unfortunately, history has glossed over all of that. So we're waxing and waning. So, here we are, we're at 1619, slaves are being brought to the country. Move forward to 1635, right? You have the first animal welfare law, which essentially says that it should be illegal to skin lambs alive, sheep alive, which of course, we all agree with, right? But that's 1635. At the same time, we have decided as a community that that should be illegal. My great-great-grandparents, great-great-great-great-grandparents are literally being forced into labor, are being whipped, are being forced to mate, are being separated from one's family. So I think there is a strange duality between animal welfare and the country and people of color that's always somehow sort of off base and not congruent. And so fast forward to the Civil War and Reconstruction. If you don't know, again, look these things up. Reconstruction was a time of huge advancement for people of color, but those advancements were then balanced out by white resentment. So that's the birth of the Klan. So we go from slavery to the Civil War, where African Americans are able to participate in their own freedom. We get the freedom, we get Reconstruction. It is a time of enlightenment. We have African Americans being voted into Congress and into the Senate and starting businesses, and all of a sudden we get this huge hammer of Jim Crow and again the Klan, and then we move forward into the 60s and 70s, and we see the same thing happening where we get the Voting Act passed in 1964, and obviously Martin Luther King is bringing, with a lot of other civil rights leaders, bringing on these new incredibly progressive ideas that are also enwrapped in Protestant and in the church. I mean, obviously Martin Luther King was a minister, but he was really trying to show us, what was being taught in white churches should apply to everyone in the country. And so here we are again in this time of enlightenment. And what happens? Martin Luther King is killed, Malcolm X is killed, Robert Kennedy is killed. And fast forward again, here we are again in this sort of ever waxing and waning opportunity for us to get it right. And animal welfare is an incredibly important industry because of how many lives it touches. And so I think here we have inside of our industry this opportunity to be a force for change for good while these doors are open, right? They're going to wax and wane. And the question is can we lead with love? Can we include ourselves as animals on this planet in need of empathy and compassion? And by the way, can we include all of us, right? I think that is the opportunity du jour, is an industry that has a connection to two-thirds of Americans have pets at home. That means Best Friends, the ASPCA, HSUS, and all of these enormous animal welfare agencies have the opportunity to change the lives of people like George Floyd by speaking up and saying, we love all of humanity and we love all of animals, and in order to save animals, we have to include all of humanity in this movement that we love.
That's just so, it's so appropriate and powerful. And we've talked before about how I feel like, and not to sound too airy-fairy, but it does feel like this country, the world, our organization, Best Friends, is, we're going through some sort of strange portal right now. And we're either going to have the strength and power to emerge on the other side as better, more enlightened humans, or we're going to be crushed under the pressure of it all. And I think that this is a really uncomfortable time. It's an uncomfortable, distressing conversation, national conversation, movement conversation. But to me, that's the only time you grow. It's like exercising a muscle. You have to go through the pain, you have to go through the commitment, you have to go through the routine of it and be consistent about it in order to break that down, in order to build that muscle back up. And, to me, as the leader of Best Friends, as the CEO of Best Friends, I'm really here to try and capture this moment and get it right. Not to be right, but to get it right. And I think part of that means, look, we all get shit wrong, all of us. And I think the real question for me, and really to my staff and the movement, is do we have the capacity to care more about someone else than our own self, than our own being? And so I think part of that is, when I talk about listening, I mean really listening. And that means, I read something the other day about what that means and why people are so afraid to listen, and why we can't seem to have those conversations in this country right now, is because if you truly listen, you might change your mind. And if you change your mind, you might change the person that you were 5 seconds ago, 10 years ago, 2 years ago, and emerge on the other side as somebody that you don't recognize. And that is a very good thing. And so I think with that basis, James, when we look at animal welfare, we talked about the blog I wrote. It is one of the widest industries out there, and it is in need of a serious wake-up call. And while we have been talking about it for 20 years, and this is Best Friends included, we have sort of put this agenda item in a box over there as if it's another program. And I think it's really time for us to look at integrating this into our overarching strategy. It needs to be baked into what we do at every single level. And so when I look at your body of work and who you represent and just the person that you are, you know that there's a 20% pet adoption gap between white Americans and African Americans. And that disparity also extends to other people of color. That is extremely alarming, but it's also an enormous opportunity, like you say. So break that down for us. What does that mean to everyone who's listening today, people in animal welfare? Tell us about that opportunity and what that means to you.
Well, for me, I have to say, I have always loved pets. And I think so many people do. I think you have to imagine me being 6 years old in an unbelievably underserved community where there are zero resources aside from the church. It's literally like you feel like you're living in a different country. But that did not separate me from the desire to have as many dogs in my house as I could possibly fit. I still had this insane sort of compassion and love for animals. Back in the day, in the early 70s, Mutual of Omaha was the show I looked forward to seeing. That was, right up there with Superman and all the other television shows that were meant for children. And I know I'm not alone in that. I think that is what's so divine about being human. If you allow yourself that divinity, you understand that what you feel is not different than what your Chinese or Korean or Japanese or Indian or whatever person across the seas, whatever they're feeling, you're feeling it, they're probably feeling it too. And we have to reach out to that 20% gap with the assumption, right, that their hearts feel exactly like our hearts. We can't look at the societal structure as a indicator of what is in someone's heart, because our societal structure is for the most part predicated on race or racism, and that's predicated on the desire to make money. We decided a long time ago that money was going to rule, that we were going to be capitalists, and we were going to be capitalists at any cost. That meant at the cost of my great grandfather being a slave and my grandmother not being able to read and passing that on to her children. We made that exchange that was okay as long as we had free labor from slaves. And when we let those slaves go, we did nothing whatsoever to catch those folks up to what would have been any kind of transformation. So, there are millions of people that were left on their own to sort of survive inside of a very harsh and very anti-Black environment. So at the end of the day, money rules, and while white America is gaining access to more wealth, that means, unfortunately, to some extent, white women have more time on their hands. And this is not to say I have 3 sisters. I'm a brother of 3 sisters and a strong mother. I get the need to empower, and not even to empower because I don't like that term, but to support women. And I won't ever be in a position where I would ever be civil towards any kind of Me Too moment that I would witness. But at the same time, white women have had an advantage, right? And in that advantage, you have time on your hands. You have time to say, how can I rescue animals, right? While Black women are struggling just to feed themselves and feed their families. So that is where the gap becomes. We are habitually judging folks that are underserved and poor, folks that we intended to be that way, right? We put them in the box and we created situations where they couldn't get out, and then we judge them when they don't have the time or energy to sort of get the information that we have because we have the time and we have the energy. So, you know, the reason why there's so many white women in animal welfare is directly related to the slave trade, directly related to capitalism, and honestly, directly related to white privilege. Now, do white men have more white privilege? Absolutely. But the next closest thing are white women. And so, you know, when you are of a marginalized set, you don't have the options always. And so I think it is time for, I think, women and animal welfare to recognize that they have the privilege. And that doesn't mean becoming, in my mind, the white savior, just to say, we're going to come to your neighborhood, we're going to fix it for you because it's been abandoned for so long. That's not what it means. It means, to me, it's time to reinvest your capital and your energy and sharing your knowledge, but also sharing your wealth and allowing these smaller communities to build their own resources. It's not so much a question of empowerment because everyone is born powerful. I don't think you can empower someone, but you can certainly get your foot off the other person's neck. And that foot comes in different shapes and sizes. It comes in the form of police brutality, but it also comes in the form of coming into someone else's neighborhood and saying, you're going to spay neuter this way because this is the way we've been doing it all these years. Instead of saying, I have some resources to share, and I know someone here is passionate about pets and understands the value of spay neuter. How would you do it, right, in your neighborhood? What language would you use? And once you help that person find that language, you build those resources. It's all about creating sustainable change so that white America is not always stepping in saying, hey, we have the solution. And because I have seen incredibly powerful people around the world, not just here, that were incredibly underserved and incredibly marginalized, but the imagination, the passion is there, but that needs to be coupled with resources. And so to me, we have to slowly but intentionally undo what we've done. And what we've done started with money, and undoing it must involve reinvestment.
I mean, it really does go back to the point you made earlier about the heart. It really is about the human heart. And I think we have said this for a very long time. We've said this at conferences. We've said this internally. I said this to my staff last week that, when I first started in this movement, it was one of our founders, Francis Batista, said, and it was like this giant reality check for me because back then there were so many animals dying. It was like this, fire hydrant, fire hose, and you were thinking about, okay, we just got to get these guys adopted. And he was like, at some point we need to integrate this work because essentially what we are is a bunch of white women mostly and men going into these neighborhoods and rescuing these animals and taking them to a wealthier neighborhood, mostly white, and adopting them out. And that is so true. And I think that might be hard for people to hear, but it's not this is a time for honest conversations. And I think the point is those communities love animals. And when you talk about 2/3 of Americans have a pet, 2/3 of America is not white. And so people love animals. And I think the point is us really figuring out how to integrate our work in a way where we are including those communities and where those communities are helping us as much as we're helping them. as an animal welfare movement and saying, how do we endeavor to really get to the bottom of what we're trying to do here? And what we're trying to do is keep pets in homes and find homes for homeless pets. And so really following those breadcrumbs to get to the real root of what we're trying to achieve, I think is so important. And, you know, I think CARE is, you guys are really focused on that adoption component and adopting into communities of color. And I think it's amazing and terrific. So talk to us a little bit about, you know, that line of work for you, what you see moving forward, especially with what's happening now, and how our entire movement can wrap our arms around this and not look at this as, oh, this is just a program we're running, but this is us as one, as a whole effort, because we all care about animals. And the bottom line is animals are the universal language. Animals don't know what nationality you are. They don't know that you speak a foreign language. They don't know that you're a different color. They are just there loving you. And so, James, I think with that, help me understand, and our listeners today, kind of that vision for really looking at this in more of a holistic way.
That was great. I actually just had made a Facebook post with my rescue dog, Guapo. He comes from a Spanish community. I just said, and I mean it honestly, you know, I am trying every day to be more like Guapo, because his framework is so simple. He knows when he's being loved. That dog has no idea that I'm a Black man. He has no idea that my wife is Korean. He could care less. And it's beautiful. And I think that we struggle with this because the human mind is so complex, and that it loves to solve problems, and we love to create problems for it to solve. And, you know, this idea that we rescue animals from communities, we bring them into shelters and rescues, we spend millions of dollars on supplying them with health and all of these necessary things, then we spend millions of dollars trying to find a home for them somewhere else when they could have been picked up a block from the shelter. Those are problems that come from the complexity of being human. It's not that being white, there's something wrong with being white, right? We'll get to that. The white people, obviously, that I love, I feel like my mother gave birth to. But what we have to figure out is how to get past being human, right? And I think what comes with being human is bias. And, you know, we repeat these narratives that we hear over and over again about other people, about the other, and we come to believe that is true. And so when someone that is of color, that looks like me, comes into, it could be a restaurant, it could be a shelter, it could be an art museum, I am often treated very, very differently than someone else. And so our intention is to break the biases down as much as possible. Like I said yesterday, biases don't leave. Biases are like an accent. I said that just to one of your staff online today. It's like having an accent. You know, no one wakes up and says, you know, hey, I'm going to have a Southern accent. That's something that you hear, and you're repeating what your parents have told you. You're repeating what your environment is telling you about linguistic signals. And before you know it, you sound like a New Yorker, right? Or you sound like you're from Boston, Kenny Lamberti, and no one can understand what you're saying when you're angry. But ultimately, right, you don't know you have an accent until someone points it out. And I think my job here to animal welfare, to say to animal welfare, is that from my perspective, I hear a very distinct accent. And that accent is anti-brown. It is anti-poor, it is anti-marginalized. If you are not middle class, then you're not good enough to have one of our pets. And like I said yesterday, if the analogy, if you raise the bar up and you said everyone in animal welfare overnight was a billionaire, the rules and the applications would be different, right? The billionaires that are all running animal welfare would be saying, hey, you should have 20 acres for German Shepherd because a quarter acre just is not good enough because that's what I have. And the reality is that we all love differently. I'm a straight male. I don't even like that term, and I love differently than the people in my family that I love that are gay, and they love other men, and that's completely okay with me. All I know is that they love each other. That's all I care about. But I think there are people amongst us that say that's not love. And so I think the sheltering and rescue community have to learn to open their hearts. That's why I love the term open adoption, because to me, it means open your heart and allow for more adoptions. And to do that, I think we have to recognize that love looks different. When you are a homeless person, loving that pet may not mean that pet has a roof over its head, but you are with that animal all day. You are communing with that animal all day. You are holding and touching and rubbing that animal all day long. It's you and that little critter, right? And I think that is very different than a lot of middle class families that I see who let their animals out. They may have a fence or yard, the animal is out there all morning long by itself. That doesn't happen with someone that is homeless. And so I think we have to accept that love comes in different varieties, and it's not, it doesn't have to be a middle class variety. It just needs to be genuine. And I think if we open ourselves up to seeing it, it will be clear as day. And that openness will allow us to see people differently and allow us to relax our honest desire to protect animals and allow more animals to be adopted, allow more animals to be fostered, and also just commune with a different community. I mean, these communities that are around the shelter, to me, it's not a requirement to always be selling adoption. It's also how do we commune with these communities so that they keep pets at home, and that just means, to me, sharing resources. There's so many brilliant people that I have met in animal welfare, brilliant dog trainers, brilliant clinicians, and all of that information they have is inside this little box called animal welfare. And I think we need to find a way to share all that beautiful information with the people surrounding our rescues and our shelters and find ways to support them. And yeah, that's my dream. I think most people are good, and a good assortment of people are uninformed. And if we have the information, we ought to just share it.
Yeah. It's so, there's so many nuggets that you've said that we could use as a quote for, just really the time that we're in and moving through this. And what this represents to me and what you're talking about is these are tenets that you've known for a very long time. And I think that with the global pandemic, and people being, we have 44 million Americans that don't have a job now. The entire American workforce is 150 million people. That is almost a third of our workforce. That is freaking staggering. You have that, you have people who are pent up in their house and they've been there for months. And, this is a domino effect that's happening. And it's smacking us right in the face. And I think it's a huge wake up call. And so for me, it's been an enormous wake-up call. And what it represents to me is change. And most people don't thrive in change. And most people are afraid of changing. And I think back, I'm going to admit here to the audience that when I first started at Best Friends, we were doing an offsite adoption event in a city not too far from where the sanctuary is. And there was this gentleman who wanted to adopt an animal, and I was doing his adoption. And we literally had an 8-page adoption application. And it was like, you know, do you exercise on Friday at 3? Do you have, I mean, it had all these, you look back on it now and it seems to me really ridiculous. And I ended up denying him, because he was a guy who lived in a garage, and he drove truck some of the time, but you know, he didn't meet my specification on this 8-page document. And he left, and he was so upset. He wasn't angry. He was just upset. And he left, and he showed up about an hour and a half later, and he said, listen, I just lost the companion of my life. Please give me a second chance. Will you come and look at where I live and how I related to this dog? And I thought, okay. And so I drove down to his shop, which was across the train tracks, you know, in a part of town that was, you're thinking, okay, is this a suitable adopter? I got there, got to his shop, and there was so much love. You could tell that this animal was the love of his life. And I just broke down crying. And I thought, what a total asshat. Like, there is something really wrong with the way that we're approaching this. Like, who am I to be that person that's suddenly, you know, judging? It just felt so weird, and it totally reframed the way I felt about adoptions, you know. And over the years, we've taken, as I know a lot of other groups and shelters have, heat for free adoptions, open adoptions, you know, all that kind of stuff. James, this is another moment in the history of our movement where we have to change. And that means getting uncomfortable. It means getting uncomfortable with who we were 5 seconds ago, and really embracing that if we're going to get to 2025 and we actually are going to save as many animals as we have the capacity to save, we need to change. And I think that, you know, I think your point of view and communities of color are absolutely 100% key to that. And I think it's about really listening and opening our hearts to bring us closer together as humans. And so, you know, I think we've talked a lot about a lot of different things, but I'm going to ask you this question because I think you've got so much wisdom, and you've been thinking about this, pets and homeless pets for 15 years, maybe 20 years, in a more formal way, in an institutionalized way. Give us a message, everyone that's listening here. You've been inside of a lot of organizations. You've been inside of a lot of shelters. You've been inside of national organizations. You've worked with a lot of different people. I think people go to you with a lot of different challenges. Give me your top 3 things that we as a movement need to change in order to evolve to that next step, to that next level.
Wow, that's a big question. I always come back to a quote. You know, I started out when I named my business Illume for a reason, because it was associated with the word illuminate. and that's to bring light into to dark places. And that was based on my love of a Martin Luther King quote that said, darkness cannot take out darkness, only light can do that. And hate can't destroy hate, only love can do that. And I think, and I'm bastardizing the quote just a little bit, but that's mostly the context. But I think we're in this spot where we have to expand what we think of as love and stop thinking so much that the animals belong to us, because they don't actually belong to us. Just because they're in our rescues or in our shelters, they are not our children. They belong to themselves. They speak for themselves, and they speak the language of love better than we're ever going to. And so the first thing we have to do is be as humane as the animals we seek to protect, right? Who judge based on things that are happening to them, not judging based on things that happened in the past or perceived might happen. Animals live in the moment, and that's why we love them. And I think if we really, really understand them and we really want to speak their language, we really want to be more like them, we have to put our judgy hats away. We have to put our biases aside. And I think that's not only the first thing we ought to do, I think it is the most important thing that we do, because if we do that, everything else falls into place. It's very similar to child rearing. You know, I have 3 beautiful children that I love more than anything. And that's what they know about me. And everything else falls into place. And I think when you understand that a dog and a cat are going to connect with a human being, and that human being comes into your facility and they sit down with that person and you can see that connection, that's an intangible. That's not something you can put on an adoption application. I went into a shelter years and years ago, and a lady looked at me and she said, "I have just the dog for you." And she said, "Sit down on the floor." So I sat down on the floor, and the dog ran to me and curled up in my lap. It was like an instant connection. And it's very similar to my dog Guapo. And he and I I know this sounds silly, but it's like I see the universe in his face. And those are the things that we should be looking for, not from the person, but from the animal. Is the animal saying, yes, I see that person as someone that I can live with? Not do I see that person as someone that the animal can live with? I think that is the difference. And, you know, it's unfortunate. This is a practice rhythm for me. I think when you are young and you're bright and you live in a community that people associate with crime and disease and violence, and that's how you're portrayed your entire life, you recognize that when you walk into an industry that is being judgmental. And so I will just tell you that in my life, I was lucky enough to have an assortment of beautiful, strong Black men, and they were not a rarity. They were a constant. I mean, these men cooked and they cleaned. You're not going to find someone that makes a better cake than my uncle. You know, it was that was the real environment. But as soon as I stepped out of that environment, people perceived me as coming from some sort of like Hell's Kitchen. And I think there is such a big gap between what people are and what we perceive them to be, and that gap is represented in the adoption gap. And so I can't, I won't, I could like pretend to enumerate that there are all these other steps, right? But I don't think there are all these other steps. I think we have to relearn what love and compassion is. And that's not just this field, but I think we need to do that as a country. We need to sort of abandon our concept that wealth means smart. Every rich man that walks into the room, or every wealthy woman that walks into the room must be smart because they've learned how to make money. They must be good because they have a really nice house. And the reality is that human animal bond is not tangible and it can't be bought. And I think it's also interesting, and Dr. Blackwell and I were just talking about that. I'm from Dr. Blackwell from UT, University of Tennessee. He mentioned today that, which is something I didn't really think about, was this idea that when you are underserved and you have a pet, that pet may be the only thing you have. So it's the treasure of your life. But if you are well-heeled and you've got your beautiful golf clubs and your beautiful Porsche and all these other accoutrements to your life, that animal may not be the most valuable thing in your life because you're spreading your life around all the things you have access to. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I think that there is something to say about someone that can have the whole world and have this companion animals. They are separating themselves over these cadre of different interests. But when you are underserved, when you're a poor Latino kid, and you've got your dog, and you could be the only thing that you have. And so the way you see that animal is precious. It's why so many homeless people actually won't go to a shelter, because the shelters won't accept the animal. So they live on the street because they won't surrender their animals. And I think that says a lot about the bond. I think all of our answers, all of the real answers, are right in front of us if we would take the blinders off, if we would just relax our preconceptions about who people are and assume that most of the people that we meet are very much like us. And they may be speaking a different accent than us, but they are essentially so much like us.
Yeah, I think that it's just I love how you've broken it down to be something so simple. And I think that we probably have a whole bunch of questions. We're going to go a little bit over, but James, I just want to say one last thing, which is that, I don't feel there are no shortcuts here. This isn't about slapping people of color on your marketing materials, or this is not going to be solved by having a few conversations and blah, blah, blah. And I think that's where, helping bring people along, that this is not this isn't a shortcut. This is a real change with real involvement and real integration. And I think that's where so many people are just like, I call it running around, waving their arms in the air, closing their eyes, which is warranted. And I'm happy it's happening, but it isn't just about adjusting your marketing material. And so I want you to end with that, and then we should take questions, because I know a lot of people want to talk to you.
Julie, I just want to put you in my coat pocket and whip you out whenever someone's not listening to me. I mean, it's so, what you just said is so true, and it's really frustrating. I mean, it's really a usurping of a movement. It's really I think the most disrespectful thing that you can do at this moment is to pretend to be interested in diversity and inclusion, again, because you see it affecting your bottom line, right? People are out here making apologies for things that they were sticking to for 10 years. And so we know that they're making those apologies because their bottom lines are being affected. There are, some 300 folks here online that are probably shelter and rescues and really interested in diversity and inclusion. And I would just say, just be careful. I think there are too many organizations out there that have seen this as, again, an opportunity to bolster their brand or to make new, have new revenue pathways. And I would say, just if someone approaches you and they are offering diversity and inclusion, your question should be, is your organization diverse and inclusive? If your organization is historically not diverse and inclusive, you are not ready to give tutelage to other organizations that are also not diverse and inclusive. And I think that is why I love you, because I know you know that you have work to do. And I know you know that you're not the one that's going to do it alone. And we've had a lot of conversations, and they've been nothing but about partnership. And that's what I love is you have the prowess to write a blog and talk about Black Lives Matter and all of these intensely emotional things, and leverage that into how you, Julie, is going to solve the problem. I mean, you have that prowess, and people would follow you. But you're not doing that. You're giving me space and time to talk about things that we share in common, but that I have a lived experience with. And I think that is, of all of the sort of, I think, things going on that I don't like, you're that bright light on the other side. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciate it.
Thank you. That means a lot coming from you.
Of course.
I love this love fest so much because I love you both. You both make me happy. And so thank you, Julie and James. And James, we have several great questions for you in the chat. So if you're ready, I got some stuff for you. All right, so the first one comes from Devin Smith. And it's, how do we overcome the history of bias in our movement? I.e., in many cases, we have established relationships with under-resourced communities that shelters are punitive. And so oftentimes, those communities do not seek us out. How do we lay the groundwork to overcome that?
So one thing I think we need to just visualize, think of bias as a stone in a river, right? We are not breaking that stone apart. That stone is too old and too hard. We are moving around that stone in a very intentional way, because at the end of the day, we're trying to move from point A to point B like water, and water moves around obstacles. It doesn't destroy them. And so focus on where you want to go. If you want to develop a relationship with the communities around you that feel like in the past you were punitive, stop being punitive, right? And don't focus on the past. Invite those folks in, absolutely accept and communicate that you believe that you were or may have been more punitive in the past than that's necessary, and you don't want to do that anymore. You need to find those leaders in those communities and say, how did you feel about what was happening in the past? Share where those punitive positions came from, because in many ways they just come out of your desire to help the animals. And from there, listen and try to find a middle ground, but certainly don't attach yourself to thinking that healing is not possible, because I think most marginalized communities and people of color in general live in two different worlds, where middle-class folks live in one world. So that world that is used to living in both worlds in many ways understands the duality that you don't understand until you sit down and talk to them, and they'll be able to communicate things to you that you would, I think, really surprise you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Lisa. I'm interested in learning more about diversity, equity, and inclusion in bringing people of color and other minority groups into animal welfare leadership work, particularly in community development work, to create sustainable community-based animal welfare resources, empowering targets of change to be agents of change. Hoping James has some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, we're interested in the same thing. I think we have to start reaching out to these communities. It may require visiting. It may be going on Facebook pages. It may be sending signals. Most people in this country have a connection to pet owners. So, it requires some deep outreach. It may require going to a community of color and finding a park. Someone's out there walking their dog. I mean, it really requires, I think, physical, and if you're an online type person, you have to reach out, you have to find these people, and you have to share with your base of friends and family that you are searching for these folks. I mean, Boys and Girls Clubs, YMCAs, if you're near a large college or HBCU, I mean, those folks are there, and I think will be very, very receptive to that conversation. When we were doing Pets for Life and traveling around and talking to people, I mean, it's really hard to not find, especially in an urban environment, folks of color that have pets. So it's a matter of reaching out. And certainly stay in touch with the CARE website. We will be reaching out to organizations of color as well. So if you're on our Facebook page and you see something or you see someone make a comment, absolutely ask that person if they're connected to other organizations of color that you could tap into.
Thank you. So many great questions. I'm trying to see with our time, trying to see like where do we want to go? Let's see. This question comes from Pamela. Someone said to me just yesterday, and it haunts me, would you be able to speak to this statement, specifics of harm and how to cause harm, or specifics of harm and how to cause harm? That's the question. From the conversations I'm having with BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, People of Color, and animal welfare, it's being made clear to me that we're causing harm to the very few BIPOC that we currently do engage with.
So doing harm how? Doing harm by the comments that we're making. I'm not sure what harm is being done. Maybe we can come back to that one.
Yeah, if there's a follow-up. And I think part of what could be happening too, and from the conversation I've been having with folks within our organization, I think it might even be like us being unaware of our biases and how that's showing up and how we're talking to folks about this within our organization. Because, there is diversity in organizations. Is it at the degree that we all need to strive for? No. But I think that there is training and awareness and education about what are the best ways, I think, of what she's saying, to talk to folks that are people of color within our organization in a way that is not offensive about these issues.
So I think if you're an organization, particularly if you're a large organization that is not diverse, I think forming committees where those committees are prescribing back to you, what they believe is appropriate is really important. So in other words, form the committee. The committees will tell you what vocabulary they're interested in, what vocabulary they believe is insensitive, right? I think we have to ask people how they perceive what we're saying and move from there. I think it's hard to offend me when that's not your intention. That's just me. I don't offend easily unless I feel like that is what you're trying to do, because I understand that you are speaking in an accent, a social accent that is different than the one that I understand. And I think that, if you have a leader like Julie that makes that clear, listen, we're all coming from different places. We are all saying similar things, but it may sound a little different. And so we all love a little differently. We also understand a little differently. And I think for people of color, just understand this, that there's so much anger and so much resentment that if you're in a large organization and it's a high performing organization and you are a person of color, you probably had to work 3 times as hard as the folks around you to elevate to that level. And so folks get very sensitive of being approached differently, being approached appropriately. And mind you, I don't speak for all people of color. So, I think that's really important to understand. That's why I think it turns out it should really be about committees and bringing people together and having that group say, hey, look, we would really appreciate being approached this way versus that way. And from there, I think opening up the floor, and also those folks of color need to understand folks are going to say the wrong thing. And that's okay if their effort is earnest,
Yeah, thank you. Another question we got from Lisa is, I think the future of animal welfare is community-based versus shelter-based. How do we get animal welfare funders to support community-driven community development so every community can have animal welfare resources they need? And Julie, you might have some insights on this too.
Yeah, I can wholeheartedly agree. That is one of the ambitions of CARE, is not just to inform and train and create narratives that highlight and support and elevate people of color, but also to start developing organizations of color within animal welfare, within communities. What was actually on the phone with Dr. Harley that well, you connected us, Jose. We had a beautiful conversation. I mean, it was like we were fast friends. And, she is very passionate about trying to find a way to stop taking animals from some of these smaller communities and, shipping these animals all over the country, but really finding a way to keep those animals in their home. And I think the way we do that is by creating small organizations within these communities that can self-serve their own communities. And how we do that, I think, is by honestly leadership. I do think that people like Julie have the prowess and the respect of the community of funders, where a best friend could say, this is a path we might take. But I think it is going to require that large organizations make that kind of commitment and do the work. And it might be difficult at first, but there are a lot of beautiful things that we've done that were difficult to do.
James, I think you're so right about looking at that community and how it can solve this issue without, again, just reverting back to past history that we know doesn't work, where we have people taking the animals out and then we don't provide any resource, anything. We don't leave anything behind. We just take the things that they love and ship them away. And I think, right now, I feel like our movement is focused on transport programs. And I think in some communities, that's necessary right now to save those lives now. Is it a long-term sustainable solution? Absolutely no way. Our point has to be helping those communities figure that piece out, and them helping us figure it out. And part of that is partnering with other agencies we never would have thought of in the past. And I think that, to me, is a big part of the solution. That's a big part of the brilliance. I think it includes, multicultural organizations. It includes government agencies. It includes agencies that have way more connections than we do as animal welfare professionals. And I think we've just been talking to the choir for way too long, not just on racial issues, but in terms of social service issues. And look, these guys already have built-in connections, and I think there is a real opportunity for us there to link all this together.
Yes, absolutely. I think we have to learn to simplify. I mean, I come from the world of design and industrial design, and that process, beautiful design, is often about subtraction, not addition. So yes, I see the transport situation now as much like a MASH unit on a battlefield. It's a necessity. But if we really want to solve the problem, we have to stop going to war. It's not how do we make a better MASH unit, how do we make a better gun, how do we make a better weapon. It's really about how do we prevent the war from starting from the beginning. And in this case, that analogy is applicable to how do we keep these animals at home, not how do we solve moving them around the country to save their lives.
Your analogies, like I've been here jotting them down, James. I'm like, another analogy that just hits home for me. So one more question, or actually I think two more questions. One of them is, we talked about the lack of diversity in management and higher positions in animal welfare. But when we look at racism as a systemic issue of society which affects education, how do we ensure that people of color who are on our staff can receive the training they need in order to be successful in management positions while fulfilling our business needs?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is something I think first we need to identify the folks who are interested in moving up in that way, because we have the resources. And we were talking earlier with some board members of CARE about sort of solving the gap on the veterinary side. There are so few vets that are graduating from veterinary schools. Tuskegee, I think, is still supplying 80 or 90% of the vets that are in the industry. And so in some ways, I think we're going to have to start earlier, because there is so much systemic racism and so much oppression in the school system that, if you were looking to curb or increase the likelihood of a middle-class white kid, you would start in high school. That's fine. But if we're talking about curbing and creating career paths for people of color, that might be a junior high school move, and I think that that's important. Now, for the folks that are on staff, I think you should not assume that everyone of color on staff is not happy exactly where they are, because moving up the ladder is, it requires a lot of responsibility. My dad turned down positions all the time, much to my mother's chagrin, but it was not something he was interested in. So I think, again, you have to ask those questions. You have to ask difficult questions, pull those committees together. As a sub-part of those committees, we should be looking at who wants to excel, and not just who wants to excel, but where do you want to excel to? And once those people self-identify and say where they want to go, organizations like Best Friends and other large organizations I think it's easier in some ways for them to find a pathway. But if you're a small organization and underfunded, then I think you have to go to those Maddie's funds and others to say, look, I've got a cache of folks here that are of color. And in this day and age, while this door is open, I think we need to look for ways to find financial solutions to get those people the advancement that they need, because we certainly find ways to financial ways to solve problems that are related to pets. So we can find financial solutions to that. I think we can find solutions to raising those boats in the harbor amongst the people we work with. I don't think that that's a difficult problem to solve. I just think we need to not make assumptions and ask the right questions.
Yes. So I think that is our time. And I just want to thank both of you for just being incredible humans first and foremost, and really amazing leaders that, Julia, I feel lucky to get to know and work with you. And James, I'm so glad our paths have crossed. And likewise. I know this is just the beginning. And just like this conversation needs to begin, the road ahead is a complex one. And we know that. But if we are kind to each other and we meet each other with curiosity, which is the quest of knowledge free of judgment, we're going to be okay. And so I'm just really honored to even be witness to this conversation. But I think this is history in the making, changing it. So thank you both so much for being a part of this.
Thank you. And I couldn't say it any better than that, Jose. That was spot on.
Well, I'm inspired.
All
It's
right.
it's an honor to be with both of you. Thank you, James. Thank you.
Likewise. Hopefully we'll see each other in person soon.
Yes, and thank you everyone who participated. We will have a recording of this by tomorrow. Please start to have these conversations, do the introspection. That's where it really does start with ourselves. And so just more to come on this, and a lot of great content coming out of the network team here at Best Friends. So thank you all and have a great evening.